about some art. You've probably seen me refer to this posing maquette several times throughout the channel. It's a really useful tool for figuring out how to place your characters in perspective. But what do we do when we want to sketch a character in perspective without the use of such a stifling underdrawing? One of the things I've tried to focus on is imagining that I'm sitting behind a camera and I'm the director of each individual sketch. And as the quote-unquote director, I have to figure out where exactly my camera is in relation to the character. The image produced by camera A is going to be drastically different than that of camera C. So let's take a step back from drawing figures and just try to understand the dynamics of planes as they shift in perspective. So if we take a square plane and position it very close to the horizon or eye line, the lines leading back to that central vanishing point converge very fast, and the two-dimensional shape actually appears much more like a trapezoid. The lower in our visual field that we bring this plane, the more parallel these lines converging to that central vanishing point appear, and the more square the actual two-dimensional shape appears. This yellow circle represents the visual field when the camera is staring straight ahead, and then as we tilt it down, those parallel lines become increasingly parallel. If instead of a flat square plane we use a cube, what you'll see happen is that our front plane will initially appear as a perfect square, and as it lowers in our visual field, our vertical lines will start to converge together, and it will appear more trapezoidal in shape. Conversely, the top plane, which is converging to a vanishing point on the horizon line, becomes more square as it lowers in our visual field. Now before we start jumping into figures, it's important to analyze how curves are going to distort in perspective as well. Just as the degree of ellipses and curves change depending on their position in the horizon and orientation to the viewer, the curves of the body are going to undergo the same transformation. So, for example, the one that I use with my students all the time is the eyebrow. When a person is standing directly in front of you, the eyebrow appears to curve upwards. But if we position the person far below the camera, what we'd see is that their brow would actually curve directly downward. And you probably already understand this intuitively. Imagine that you take a cup and you place it directly in front of you. What you notice is that the top edge appears completely flat. But then as you take the cup and lower it down towards your feet, that top plane appears increasingly circular. So getting back to our initial setup, we'll start by drawing the character with the camera positioned directly above looking down. What you'll see is that, as I mentioned, the eyebrows and brow are going to curve directly down, the nose is going to overlap the cheeks and mouth, and the head is going to overlap the shoulders. And just like a cylinder placed far below the horizon line, all of my curves have a very wide degree and appear very circular. And it's under these circumstances that we're going to get the greatest degree of foreshortening. In other words, whenever the camera is positioned directly above looking down or directly below looking up, the figure appears the shortest it could possibly appear. Now as we lower the camera down to position B, what we're going to see is that those curves will start to trend upwards just a little bit more, will expose a bit more of the face, and the foreshortening will be less dramatic. Notice that in A, the head was completely in line with the shoulders, but now in B, the head pokes above and breaks the silhouette. But again, since we're still above looking down, there will be some foreshortening and overlap of the jacket onto the shoes below. Now as we position our camera at location C, everything appears as though it would if we were staring directly out in front of us. The figure is no longer foreshortened, so it appears at its normal length, and all of the curves are restored to their natural state. As I mentioned earlier, the eyebrows are curving somewhat upwards, unlike the previous two examples where they sloped downward. Drawing in a cube for reference of the perspective really demonstrates the same effects occurring as we saw earlier with our forms. In this top-down view, those vertical lines on the front plane converge really fast, and we see just a small sliver of that front. And because the top plane is so far below the horizon, it appears perfectly parallel, and we see the true shape of that plane, just as we're seeing on the top of the head. Position B is that halfway point between the top-down view in A and eye level at C. And now, once again at eye level, that top plane is obscured by the front plane, which on the figure means that we can't see the top of the head. and every curve and form that lies below the horizon line will have an upward slope back to that central vanishing point. Now, another way that we can introduce a dynamic perspective is by changing the lens length. By using a lens that has a shorter focal length or a wider angle, we can capture the entirety of a figure while positioning the camera much closer to them. Because the difference in the angle of light is going to appear drastically different the closer you are to an object, the wide-angle lens has this tendency to produce a very dramatic-looking effect. So you can see that the further you bring the camera away from the figure, the angle that light has to travel to reach the lens becomes closer and closer. The practical effect of this is that as we use a wide-angle lens, all of our vertical lines are going to be somewhat curved. Everything that's above the horizon line is going to curve upward more and more, and likewise everything that's below is going to curve downward at a more extreme rate. So I'll sketch this first figure near a profile view with a wide-angle lens. If we use vanishing lines that go from repeated elements like the shoulders, the hip bones, and the feet, you'll see that there's a great deal of convergence going back to that vanishing point on the right. Elements that are the furthest away from the horizon line, like the feet, show the greatest difference in their position. If we pivot our character so that we're seeing them in a front view, all the lines that are going to the sides are going to appear perfectly horizontal, even if we're using a wide-angle lens. So in this instance, when you draw vanishing lines from shoulder to shoulder and from hip bone to hip bone, they're just going to appear as horizontal lines. However, if you were to simplify the appendages of the body into cylinders, you'd see that the legs, which rest below the horizon line, have a very wide degree, and would appear as though we're looking down at them. Everything on the face curves upwards more than usual because we're looking from beneath the chin up. So you're seeing the underside of the nose and jaw, and those eyebrows tend to curve upward a bit more. One of the other effects of a wide-angle lens is that it dilates the proportions of elements that are close to it. This is particularly notable if you're bringing the wide-angle lens to eye level. The three-point perspective created by the lens means that everything that's below eye level appears smaller and smaller. Now we're seeing only the top plane of the feet, and the distance between the two is a lot larger than it was before. As we pivot the character to a near profile view, we can see the distance in symmetrical elements becomes the most dramatic. The eyes, since they're at the horizon line, appear horizontal from one another. But the angle between the feet is vertical since they're so far below the horizon line. And then once again, if we pivot the character so we're seeing them in a front view, symmetrical elements are going to be horizontally across, no matter what lens we're using. And you can see that all of the circular wrapping lines on the legs have a really wide degree since they're so far below the horizon line. As I'm showing here, I'll occasionally draw in a reference block that I'll use before starting my sketch. Alright, so if you made it this far, thank you so much for sticking it through to the end. If any of these topics were confusing, be sure to check out some of my other videos on perspective, as well as some of my other videos on drawing characters in dynamic poses. And if you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and subscribe, and consider supporting the channel on Patreon. We have many great options, from discounted prices on future Gumroads, group lessons, and one-on-one lessons. And if you'd like to watch some of my long-form, real-time videos, you can head over to gumroad.com/moderndayjames for some extended length tutorials. Take care.